Hey, welcome to the channel. Today I'm going to be looking at the Trump administration's tariffs and the trade war that has come about because of them. I want to see what the problems are that they were supposed to address and if they are in fact working. But in order to do that, we first have to have a full understanding of what tariffs are and what they're used for. As usual, I'll be indicating the source of the information on the screen and putting the link in the video description below. And this is a nonpartisan look at the tariffs. It's not meant to focus on any one political party or any one position. So look strictly at what the facts are and if they are working or not. So let's begin with looking at the issues that the Trump administration is attempting to address. So the Trump administration said that it is focusing on unbalanced trade. In other words, the trade deficit. So is this really an issue? When we're in a situation of unbalanced trade, it tends to suppress employment in manufacturing in the United States. But it's been like that for decades. You'll notice that the trade deficit has gotten significantly worse under the Trump administration so far. This is likely due to people buying foreign products prior to the tariffs being put in place. And I'll talk a little bit more about the trade deficit in just a few moments. Some have argued that the lack of manufacturing jobs is due to automation. Well, while this is partially true, there has been an impact of automation. The actual impact has come from trade deficits that have been around since 1997. So this is not an issue for any one single president. It has been a problem since the Clinton administration. And we've had 4 terms under Democratic leadership and 4 terms under Republican leadership, including Trump's first term. Globalization of the economy also reduces bargaining power for workers. It gives companies a fallback position so when negotiations with their workers fall apart, they can still go to manufacturing overseas should that wage bargaining break down. Not to mention the fact that many of these countries have lower relative labor costs than the U.S. anyway. Another argument is also that the dollar is overvalued. Basically, the dollar is worth a lot of money relative to other countries. And this has certainly affected the trade flows. Basically, the more valuable the dollar is, it is in essence making the foreign goods cheaper to U.S. consumers because of the buying power. U.S. consumers, because they're saving money, will buy the foreign goods, which then reduces demand on domestic goods, mainly because it's just cheaper. At the same time, the dollar strength means that for foreign consumers, their money isn't as valuable as the U.S. dollar, so they're unable to purchase U.S. goods because for them, it is in essence much more expensive for them to buy, simply because their currency is not as valuable. This further reduces the demand on U.S. domestic goods, which in turn reduces domestic manufacturing. It's a classic supply and demand problem. To begin with, we need to understand the greater import-export system. There are always going to be one of 3 fees that are paid when products are being brought into the United States: customs duties, import taxes, or tariffs. Customs duties are fees paid based on a product characteristic and is fixed by the U.S. government to determine how freely a product can be let into the country. They're usually put in place to attempt to stop other countries from sending too much of a product that's already made here. And the customs amount is based on the import value of that particular product. And the rate can vary anywhere from 0 to 30 or 40%. And rates are applied to certain categories of materials and products. So the impact of these customs duties on consumers happens in 2 different ways. When there are higher duties imposed on imported goods, that helps to boost U.S. manufacturing and encourages companies to source from U.S. companies for any of their parts or goods that they need. It basically promotes U.S. jobs, resources, and many other factors. When those customs duties are lowered on imported goods, consumers end up paying less because the final price is lower. And also the source is a lower cost, which also drives down parts and things that are being used in U.S. products. It drives those down as well. In essence, customs fees are used to encourage U.S. manufacturing. The next category of fees on imports are import taxes. These are fixed rates calculated on the total value of the product, sometimes known as the value added tax or VAT. It's a standard percentage defined by the government. It's an additional cost added to any imported product coming into the country. Examples of these taxes are, again, the value added tax or VAT, or goods and services tax, GST, or for Canada, the Canadian Provincial Sales Tax, or PST. A flat percentage rate is applied to all products being imported, not just a particular category. And the U.S. is one of the few countries that does not have a VAT or GST. In countries that have VATs or GST, the sellers must clarify to their customers upfront who is responsible for paying that tax. And two categories can be used. One's called a landed cost solution, supplier basically paying the tax, or you can let the customer pay the tax. In either case, these import taxes are used to raise revenue for the government. Tariffs are fees applied to specific products from specific countries for a specific amount of time. They're calculated from the import value of the product, and very often these fees are passed on to the end customers, so you as a consumer will end up paying these. Tariffs can drastically change the prices of imported goods, as we've seen in particular with the import tariff on Chinese goods. And it definitely will affect consumer spending. And this change can happen very quickly, as we've seen as the values of the tariffs change very quickly, and also it's affecting consumer spending very quickly. In the end, though, tariffs are used to encourage consumption of domestic products. But tariffs have specific uses in order for them to be effective. They provide effective protection for domestic production in specific economic sectors, shielding U.S. workers from unfair forms of competition from specific trading partners, like those with abusive labor rights regimes. Tariffs also provide effective protection for domestic production in specific economic sectors as well. There is a direct benefit of tariffs in protection of domestic sectors in the U.S. economy that warrant strategic support. And the tariffs go directly to target some of the sectors that are harmed when trading partners take actions to support their own domestic exporters or undercut labor and clean air and water standards. In addition, tariffs can be used as the protection of supply chains for critical products. If you think about things like computer systems in our fighter jets, those things need to be positively controlled to ensure that an adversary doesn't create a backdoor that could harm that particular asset. And finally, tariffs are used to combat monopolization. We saw this a lot during COVID when everyone was looking to get respirators and protective equipment. A lot of it was not made in the U.S. and it left the U.S. struggling to get those products. In addition, tariffs shield U.S. workers from unfair forms of competition from specific trading partners. Higher tariffs can be used to protect worker rights, ensure a more even playing field for labor costs, and can even be used to ensure that standards are met, including environmental standards. However, tariffs are not meant for long-term or broad use. So the question comes down is, can high and broad-based tariffs fix the U.S. trade deficit or rebuild manufacturing and employment? Well, the short answer is no. They're not really suited for that type of use and would cause damage to the wider economy. I'll discuss that more here in just a few moments. It also reduces exports along with the imports, and this will leave the balance of trade mostly unchanged. There are several additional reasons that exports fall when tariffs are introduced. Basically, the cost, for one. Many U.S. exports use imports as intermediate inputs, basically parts for those goods. And so when those pieces are brought in, it raises the cost of the final good produced in the U.S. And this boost in the price of the U.S. export makes them less competitive in the global market. The next area is retaliation. We've seen trade partners retaliate to the U.S. tariffs with tariffs of their own, making exports more expensive in international markets as well. And finally, as I mentioned before, the dollar valuation. Tariffs tend to put upward pressure on the value of the dollar in global markets, which again makes our exports even more expensive because other people's currency has a lower value in comparison. And it's also a double-edged sword because it still, in some cases, reduces the cost of the imports, so U.S. customers continue to buy the imports even with the tariff in place. So, based on the research, as you've seen, and the economic experts saying that tariffs aren't the best way to address the trade deficit, are the tariffs working at all? Trump claimed that he was bringing in $4 trillion worth of companies back into the U.S. due to the tariffs. So what is the real tally? As you can see here, there's a lot of different companies that have pledged to bring their manufacturing into the U.S. and to invest in the U.S. And to be fair, I have prorated some of these funds to be just for the 4 years of the Trump term. A good example is drug maker Eli Lilly said that they would bring in $27 billion over 5 years. If you reduce that to 4 years, it'll be $21 billion over the Trump administration's term. In addition, another good example of keeping things fair, Johnson & Johnson said that they would bring in $55 billion over the next 4 years, but actually is only a 25% increase over what they had said they were going to do anyway. So it's really an $11 billion increase for Trump. One of the bigger ones is United Arab Emirates. Had said that they will invest $1.4 trillion over 10 years. That's about $560 billion over the Trump term in AI infrastructure, semiconductors, energy, and American factories. So if you add all these up, you're really talking probably really over Trump's term of $1.9 to $2 trillion worth of investment. In comparison, the Biden administration, as of October of 2024, had created over 700,000 new manufacturing jobs and announced over $910 billion in private manufacturing investments. And in November of 2024, the Small Business Administration announced an all-time high of more than 20 million business applications filed under the Biden administration. I bring this up for comparison's sake, because if you consider that the Biden administration created $910 billion over 4 years, and the Trump administration is in essence creating $2 trillion, and he's done that in the first 100 days, that is pretty impressive. However, we'll see that small businesses are also going to be affected by these tariffs. Now, again, I'll get into that in just a moment. So some other positive impacts of the tariffs is that Pfizer said it would move overseas manufacturing to its existing plants in the U.S. if required. Stellantis, which owns Chrysler, Dodge, Fiat, and Jeep, reversed plans to shutter their Belvidere, Illinois plant. Volkswagen is considering opening sites for Audi and Porsche brands in the U.S. And Volvo's chief executive said that the automaker may move some of its manufacturing to the U.S. It's basically still feeling things out at this point. Two Taiwanese electronics firms, Compal Electronics and Inventec, so they might make investments in the U.S. and LG Electronics and Samsung are both considering moving some of their appliance operations to the U.S., as well as LVMH, which owns Louis Vuitton and Dior, Italian liquor group Campari, and the Swedish hygiene company Essity are all planning on U.S. manufacturing if things continue the way they are. They haven't committed 100%, but they are considering it. So now let's look at the areas where it didn't work. Most automakers are not rushing to move parts production to U.S. factories. Basically, the factory retooling cost is still more than buying the foreign-made parts. And to be honest, other retooling situations, like for cheap products, say, as a good example, your plastic forks, knives, and spoons, they're only a couple of dollars to buy normally. Most manufacturers would not retool their factories to make those low-ticket items either. The cost is just too high compared to buying the foreign-made items, even with the tariff. So we'll also see higher prices. Best Buy has warned the American shoppers of higher prices, and Target has also warned about price hikes, particularly on vegetables and fruit from Mexico during the winter. And a lot of these companies are shifting their sources, but not to U.S. Target, for example, is looking at sourcing brands from the Western Hemisphere, like Guatemala and Honduras, and away from China. Kroger is diversifying its supplier base for some commodities in its fresh food business, and possibly shifting to geographies that will be less affected by tariffs in order to keep the prices low. Costco said its structure actually allows it to adjust its merchandise mix more easily than most other stores, and they would source products from countries with lower tariffs. Alcoa rerouted its Canadian-made aluminum to Europe to avoid U.S. tariffs and sent its Australian output to the U.S. to optimize the global system based on the new tariff structures. Hewlett-Packard said that they would leverage the global supply chain to mitigate aspects of the expected impact of the tariffs and adjust their prices as well. And finally, the Bratz dolls maker MGA Entertainment, which is a major supplier of toys to Walmart and Target, was speeding up its shift out of China and taking steps to move 40% of its manufacturing to India, Vietnam, and Indonesia within about 6 months. And really, we've seen that China doesn't really care about these tariffs. They've stated they're playing the long game and they're finding other partners in the world. So while, yes, it is affecting China's trade, they're not really willing to come to the table like some of the other countries have. So one of the biggest losers in this happens to be small businesses. For small business stores, they're seeing disruptions in their supply chain. It's causing delays in small businesses getting their products for their stores, leading to longer wait times for their customers, and in turn a loss of revenue if those customers can get the products elsewhere. Small business manufacturers are seeing increase in the costs of their raw materials, which are having to pass on to their customer, and both small business stores and manufacturers have to seek relief through suppliers at lower tariffed countries. We're also seeing some small businesses that are suppliers for larger retailers being informed that the larger business would not accept an increase in the prices due to the rise in tariffs, particularly the tariffs on China. That's putting a lot of pressure on the small businesses and causing them for a loss of profits. It's creating a substantial power imbalance between suppliers and retailers. Right now, the only ones that seem to be okay are the big companies with lots of money to back them up. This makes me wonder, is this a way to get rid of the small business competition? Because it certainly has a greater effect on small businesses versus these large companies. So let's look at inflation. Inflation was admittedly high during the Biden administration. But it was also during a time of reaction right after COVID. During COVID, we saw a shrinking of our economy and people not buying things. And so when people are allowed to go back out and shop and buy things, it rebounded in a big way. Because of that, it caused a lot of inflation because of the supply and demand. So let's look at market value. Overall, when you look at the market value, as you can see in this chart, it is down, but it is still higher than it was 5 years ago. So the question is, to me, is there any insider trading going on? And what I mean by is there any insider trading going on is because if you happen to be in the Trump administration circle, and in fact we've seen this with President Trump saying, now would be a good time to buy, and then him reducing the tariffs, which caused an upward spike in the market. How many of these people in his inner circle are benefiting from that? Consumer costs. We've seen across the board that things are getting more expensive for everything, and it's only going to get worse as these tariffs continue. It's just the way it is. Those tariffs are passed to the consumer, which drives up the cost of the things that you need to buy. The dollar strength. As I mentioned, dollar strength can cause a trade deficit. Now, it did drop quite significantly, but it's still relatively strong, and it is shown to be coming back up in economic projections. So really, that did not change anything there. So let's look at the GDP, the gross domestic product. The GDP measures the monetary value of final goods and services that, those things that are bought by a consumer. And they're produced by the U.S. or really any country over a given period of time. It counts all of the output generated within the borders of a country. The GDP includes all the goods and services produced, along with some non-market production, such as defense spending and education services provided by the government. So basically, the GDP is an indicator of how much the U.S. is actually producing. So we've had reporting for the first quarter of 2025 that the GDP has had negative growth of 0.3%. The other time when there was significant negative growth of the GDP was during the first Trump administration. And this was due to COVID and the fact that we couldn't go into work or produce anything. We were in effect shut down. This then jumped up during the Biden administration as consumers and people went back to work and purchases and normal buying activities started happening again. And while we are showing a negative growth for the first quarter of 2025, so long as it doesn't continue, the forecasts are showing that the GDP will remain relatively steady as we go throughout the year. So let's look at the trade deficit and if these tariffs really are doing anything. If you look at what happened right at the beginning of 2025, we saw a huge amount of spending for those imported goods. So it made the trade deficit much worse. And that's likely because of people wanting to get those products before the tariffs went into place. We also saw a strong dollar, making the products relatively cheaper for American consumers, while making the U.S. exports more expensive for foreign buyers, again adding to that trade deficit. And in addition, a growing U.S. economy, that growing GDP, also leads to a larger deficit since consumers have more income to buy more goods from abroad. So is this an artificial problem simply because consumers have more money to spend and the value of the dollar goes further? It kind of looks to me like that strong dollar has enabled U.S. consumers to purchase lots of foreign goods for decades, while other countries, in effect, have to pay a premium for the U.S. goods just because their currency isn't as strong. Of course, there's some other factors there as well, but in essence, that's really what's going on. The other thing that's confusing to me is that in 2024, Canada, Mexico, and China were the top 3 countries where our exports went. And I don't understand why you would start a trade war with the key countries where most of your exports are going. Wouldn't you want your exports to at least continue at the same volume or increase? I don't understand why that was a priority. And we've definitely seen that the tariffs have led to retaliation and a large amount of U.S. exports stopping their flow to those trade partners. So, how have the tariffs done? Have the tariffs addressed the trade imbalance? Well, really, when we look at it overall, they increase consumer costs, they cause retaliatory tariffs, and really, aside from the dollar potentially being on shakier ground, the value of the dollar has not really changed and continues to be strong. So U.S. products continue to be expensive for foreign countries. And while the tariffs have brought in a significant amount of investment by large companies into the U.S., small businesses in the U.S. are struggling or closing entirely. Overall, tariffs really have had minimal positive impact and have caused significant problems. They've increased the cost to the consumer and in effect increased U.S. consumer taxes because of the import fees being passed along, the result of which will likely be less spending. Short term, that may actually lead to a surplus of goods and lower prices on some items, but long term, it will reduce consumer spending and will likely result in a loss of jobs due to a lack of demand, particularly among small businesses. And while they have had a hugely negative effect on the stock market, overall the stock market remains relatively strong if you look at it long term. But probably the biggest negative is that the Trump administration has in effect pissed off all our trading partners, which will likely result in less cooperation in the future, fewer opportunities, and a destruction of the trust that took decades to build. Really, I think that a lot of this could have been accomplished through targeted engagements with these same companies and trading partners without the broad use of tariffs, although likely over a longer period of time. And when I say a longer period of time, probably a year or two. And doing it that way would not have caused injury to our standing with our trading partners, international cooperation, or impacted the U.S. consumer's wallet. In short, while the investment in the U.S. resulting from the tariffs is impressive, the long-term impact, loss of political standing with our partner nations, impact on small businesses, and loss of soft power around the globe due to the negative impact on partner nations may not be worth it and could likely have been accomplished through a more planned and targeted approach. If you like what you've seen, please like and subscribe for more content, and any support via Patreon is highly appreciated. So remember, reason before reaction, and thank you for watching.